let's learn how to create this stencil effect in Lens Studio. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our stencil effect. So there are two main parts to this effect. The first one is going to be the actual stencil part, and then the second part is going to be the background. And so I'm going to start by setting up the background first, and I'm going to go ahead and use a separate camera and render target and layer, just because I want to have a little bit of control over this before I layer the stencil effect on top of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create a new camera. And I'm going to call this my background cam. And I want to output this to a new render target. So in the resources panel, let's really quickly add a render target. I'll just call this background. Now my camera, I'm going to select that new render target. I'm going to change it to orthographic because this is just going to have 2D images in it. And then just to keep things nice and clean, I'm just going to move it to its own layer. I'll also call that background. Okay, so we have our camera, new layer, new render target. Now let's go ahead and get our background set up. So I'm going to add a screen image. Now by default, screen images are placed on the orthographic layer. So I'm going to go ahead and change mine to background. Now I've added a screen image. You can see here that there's a placeholder image, but we don't see anything in the preview. So what I need to do is I'm going to come to my scene config, and I'm going to change my live target to the background, just while I'm setting this up so we can see what's going on. And then also I'm going to slide this background up. I want to move it to the top of the render order because I want this background to feed into the stencil effect. So I just want to make sure it's rendered first. Okay, so camera, we have a place for the screen image. So let's go ahead and import our images. So here I just have a few paper and parchment images. Now a good place to find images is Pixabay. They're all free to use. So I just typed in paper, and then here's an image. You can scroll through. There's lots of stuff going on in lots of these images, but usually you can go on through a couple of pages and you can find what you need. So that's what I did. I just downloaded a few paper images. Now a quick note about those images. You can download them at different sizes. Since this is a background element, I don't ever go above a resolution of 1280 pixels on either horizontal or vertical dimensions, just to keep the file sizes down. It doesn't need to be the most high resolution thing because it's the background. So 1280 gives you enough detail, but it's going to keep your file sizes down. All right, so back to the studio. So I have my images here. So let's just go ahead and add one to my screen image really quick. So I'll just pick one, drag one over. So you can see we aren't filling the whole screen. So I'm going to change this to fill. I'll just make sure that my image stretches. Well, not stretches, so it scales, so we filled in whole screen without any stretching. And so this will work on both phone or desktop, like Snap Camera. Okay, so I have that in there, but I do want to be able to cycle through multiple images for my background. So we need to write a script. So I'm going to go ahead and add my script, but all the hard work is already done. If I open this in the built-in editor, I'm not actually going to write any code right now myself, because if we come over to my virtual background tutorial, there is already a script that we create there that we can just copy and paste. So there'll be a link to this in the description, but yeah, all you need to do is just copy that. We'll come over here, we'll paste, and we'll save that. I'll just attach the script to my background camera. And for the background, I'll select that screen image. And then the image values, I'll just hold down Control or Command if you're on the Mac, select all your images, hit OK. And now we can click or tap through and we cycle through all of our images. Easy peasy. All right, so we have our background being set up. So now let's go ahead and actually start creating our stencil effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a custom material for that. So in the resources panel, let's go ahead and add a graph empty material. And we can rename this if we want. It's the only material that we're going to have in here, so it doesn't matter too much. And then we want to come up here and click Graph Editor. And then just so it's a little easier to see what's going on, I'm going to go ahead and rearrange my workspace. So up here on the inspector panel, I'm just going to click and drag that. I'll stick it up here by the objects panel. We won't be messing with our scene too much. But we do need one more orthographic camera screen image. So let's go ahead and add that now, and then we'll start making our material. So I'm just going to add a screen image. That should give you a new orthographic camera, give you the new screen image. We won't see anything here. That's because we still have our background render target. So let's go back to the regular render target. Now you can see we have some stuff going on. So our screen image in the inspector, I'm going to move my graph empty material there. Now we just have a white texture here because if we look at our material in the material editor, we just have a single color there. So that's fine. We'll go and start fixing that in just a second. In stretch mode, I'm just going to change it to stretch. So we are going to be using our camera input for this material. So if it is just fit or something, it should be fine. But I just like to use stretch just to make sure there's no like empty bands at the top or bottom. Okay, so let's go ahead and start creating our material. So the basic setup is we just need to be able to take our image and separate it out and turn it into just two colors. So as we're setting this up, we'll just stick with just white and just black. But there'll be a lot of kind of noise or fine detail in certain parts of the image. So what I'm going to do first is actually slightly blur the image so that we get some smoother lines. So it's not going to be too extreme. It's just going to help us smooth things out a little bit. So let's go ahead and start making that blurring effect. So I'm going to add a node. I'm going to start with a texture 2D object parameter. And I'm going to name this base texture. So this title here is what will show up over here in our material properties in the inspector. So there's nothing here yet because it's not hooked up. So we'll see that in just a second. We'll need some UV coordinates. So go with the screen UV coordinates. And let's add our Gaussian blur. Zoom in a little bit so we can see this. Now you can see we have this blur factor. So anytime there's some value we can adjust here, I'm going to go ahead and add a parameter node. So in this case, a float parameter. And so what this will do, it will give us a control over here in the inspector panel. Just make things a little easier to change. So let's hook that up. Let's give it a quick title. I'll call this blur strength. Now, when this appears, it'll just be a number we can type in. If we enable the min and max, it'll actually give us a slider. So for the max, let's just put 5. Let's put our coordinates in here. Now you'll see this pixel size input. We can just kind of guess what values we want to add. Or if we come to this 2D object parameter, we can expose the size output. And that gives us the pixel size. I'll plug in the texture. We'll plug this into our shader. Now it's all nice and purple. But once things have been connected, we can now add our base texture. I'll just go with the device camera texture, just what the camera sees. Now if we adjust our blur strength, you can see our image starts to get blurry. Now if we go too high, you kind of see this ghosting or haloing effect, especially if you look at the eyes. Now there are multiple eyes. That's not going to matter for our stencil effect because we aren't going to blur it this much. But if you are working on the project and you need a really high blur, instead of setting it up this way, come and add a post effect and choose the Gaussian Blur. Now, I haven't looked really closely. It all looks to be set up the exact same way as this, but it gives a much smoother result with the blurring. There's probably some setting I'm missing somewhere. But if you need a nice smooth blur, you can grab the Gaussian Blur post effect. But we aren't going to be blurring things that much here. It's going to be just around like maybe 1 to 2, somewhere in there. So we're good with this setup. Okay, so we have our slight blurring, so let's go ahead and start to split this out into just 2 colors. So I'm going to add a new node. I'm going to use Luminance. So this will essentially turn our image into a grayscale version, kind of based on kind of the brightness of the pixels. So each pixel has a red value, green, blue, and then this alpha channel, which is transparency. The luminance is going to take all of that and produce a single value. So black would have a value of 0, white would have a value of 1. And so this luminance value is going to be really handy for just kind of splitting this and giving us 2 separate colors. So let's go ahead and do that so we can see what the heck I'm talking about. I'm going to add an isGreater node. So I'll take this in, and since I'm comparing it to a value, I want to create a float parameter so that we can easily adjust it. We'll call this threshold, min and max, and 0 to 1 is fine because that's what our pixel values will be. So let's go ahead and plug that in, and now everything is white. And that is because our threshold defaults to 0, and so everything is greater than 0 in this particular image. And so isGreater is going to produce a true value, which ends up being equated as 1. So it's all just white. If I increase this threshold, now you can see we get some of the black coming in, which if our value is less than now 0.49, then this isGreater is going to be false at that part, and false ends up being 0. So we get this nice white and black split. So I'm going to just kind of play with the threshold. I want to have enough outline to see the face, but not too much where it starts to get obscured. And now if we play this blur strength, you can see if we bring it down, we get lots of fine detail, kind of ragged edges. As we increase our blur strength, we can smooth things out. So I want to have enough blur where I'm smoothing the edges, but not so much where we start to lose definition and we start to see that weird artifacting. So somewhere around 1.6, 1.5, somewhere in there seems to work fine. All right, so far so good, but I'm going to add another little extra step here because this just gives us white or black. I do want to be able to adjust those colors if needed. So we'll do an if else, and we'll plug in some colors here. So let's add some color parameters. We'll copy that. So this first one we'll call high color. The second one we'll call low color. Okay. I want that capitalized just so they're the same. Okay, so now we can change the slow color. Let's just stick with white and black for now. So nothing different than before. This just lets us configure the colors. All right, so let's just clean this up a little bit. So just a quick recap. We're bringing in some base texture. We're blurring it, going grayscale, then turn it into just 2 colors. So as you can see, everywhere that's black will be our stencil, and then we want everything that's white to essentially become see-through so that we can see our background showing through. So let's go ahead and do that part next. So I'm going to move this shader output over a little bit. And let's go ahead and bring in our background. So this time I'm going to add a texture 2D parameter. So the texture 2D parameter lets us read in an image and just gives us the straight pixel color values. If we look back here, the texture 2D object parameter outputs a 2D texture that then somehow has to get transformed into the RGB values. So the Gaussian blur takes care of that. We don't need it here, but the texture 2D sample would be also how you convert a texture into just the color values. So we don't need to worry about that. That's just the difference between the 2 ways I'm reading in the images. So we'll call this background, and then we want to blend that with our stencil effect here. So I'm going to look up the blend node. Now I want the stencil effect on top, so I'll put that into the base. I'll put the background down here into the color. Now I'll connect that here. And we get this checkerboard. We need to select our background, so I'll select the render target. And now we're just seeing the paper backgrounds. We aren't seeing our stencil. And that's because we need to change our blend mode. So I'm going to choose multiply. And we can see our stencil effect working. So what's going on is, if we remember when we were talking about this is greater stuff with the luminance, the color white has a value of 1. And if you multiply anything by 1, you just get that number back out. So when we do this multiply blend mode, anything that is underneath the white is going to show through. So it essentially turns the white transparent. And then the black is a value of 0. And so anything multiplied by 0 is 0. So that's why we can see the stencil effect here. It's kind of taking over what's in the background. And so this is kind of our basic effect. But it is kind of just kind of slapped on top there. It's very harsh. It's not merging with the background at all. So there are a couple things we can do to help that out. And the first one is to change this low color. So the high color I want to keep as white, because if I change it, we're going to start kind of changing the hue of what's back here. Now, depending on your scene, you might want to do that. So you can change the overall color of what's going on in the background. I don't want to do that. I'm going to keep this high color as white, but my low color, I'm going to drop my opacity. So an alpha channel of 255 means we fully see this color. If I take it down to like 180, it's going to start to become transparent. Not sure that it matters too much right now. It's just a straight black. But I'm going to bring up the brightness more into kind of a darker gray. And I'll move this cursor up so we start to get browns. You can play with this. And I'll go with this. Maybe my alpha channel didn't actually do anything. Okay, I guess the alpha channel doesn't matter with this multiply. So you can just keep it as is. But here at this brown, now it blends in with the paper background a lot better. It looks more like it's drawn on the paper. And you can see the paper texture showing through. So this is a lot better, but it's still kind of harsh because the paper is textured, and then our stencil effect is just flat. It's all a singular color. Even though we can see the paper texture kind of coming through, it still kind of stands out. So the last trick is we're going to add some random noise to our texture to help break it up. So I'm going to scoot back here because we're going to need our UV coordinates. So let's add our random noise. And the UV chords we want to put into the seed. So I'm gonna, let's just take a quick look at how this works really quick. So the random noise, plug into the color, we just get some random color. It's just gray. Now there's a scale here. If I were to change that to like 50 by 50, we see the color change, but it's just still a singular color. And so what I think how this works is this seed, a seed just kind of tells the computer how to generate a random number. So if you want the same random number time after time, you set the seed. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the UV coordinates as the seed. And so what this is going to do is it's essentially going to change the seed at each kind of position in the image. So now we get this more noisy image. I don't know if that's right or not, but if you plug the coordinates into that seed, you get what you expect. It's just static. So I'm going to change my scale to 1000 by 1000, so it's really fine-grained. Now I want to kind of blend this with my stencil effect, but not my background. So I'm going to bring in 2 more nodes. I want a multiply and a mix. So let's start with the multiply node. So I'm going to take my stencil output, multiply it by the random noise. Now if we look at what that looks like, you can see we get the noise in the dark part of our stencil, but it's also in the white parts. And if we want to use this in our blend mode, now we just get this nasty staticky looking background. And we don't want that. So we're going to mix our noisy stencil image with just plain white to make sure you get white back in this background. So we'll plug our staticky image into the top part of the mix. Our second input, we just want the color white. And then for the ratio, we're going to also grab our stencil image, but the non-noisy one. And if we plug this into our blend, now it's working. You can see we have some noise added to the dark part of our stencil, and then this white part is just plain. So let's talk about why that works. So if we remember our if else is greater white, we can think of it as having a value of 1, black is a value of 0. Now we did change this low color, so it's not quite black, but it's still dark, so we can consider it having a value of 0. So what this mix does is we have this top input A and the second input B in this ratio. So if our ratio is 0, it will be completely input A. If our ratio is 1, it'll be completely input B. And anything in between will start to blend between the two. It'll mix it together. So what we're doing is, since we're taking our stencil and putting it into the ratio, before we've added the noise, anywhere here that's white, coming out of the mix will also be white. Because the ratio will be 1, so we'll grab the second input rather than the noisy part. So that is why this mix now lets us have noise on just the dark part of the stencil, but not the rest of the background. That might still be a little confusing, so let's just walk through it one more time. So here's our original stencil. So we have dark, then our white part becomes transparent with the blend. We multiplied in the noise, but that makes the entire thing noisy. So then when we use the original stencil as kind of the mixing factor, we can make sure the noise only comes through on the dark part of the stencil. So if that's still a little fuzzy, just kind of play around with some of the nodes. The mix node is pretty useful, especially with this ratio. So just play around. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. And that is essentially it for this lens. Since we had our background set up with our script and our separate render target, we can go ahead and tap through it. And if we wanted, we could even come in here to our screen image, and we can change our stretch mode, and that is controlled independently of our material here. We could have had our paper images directly coming into this background, but the separate render target gives us a little more control over how the image fits on the screen. And then we have our scripts to easily tap through and change what we're seeing. So yeah, maybe kind of a hasty / rambly tutorial, but it's a nice little effect. It seems to do well whenever I use it. So the gist, again, just blur your image a little bit, convert it to black and white, add a little noise, change the colors, blend it in. Then you have this nice stencil effect that you can add to like a brick wall or wood or paper or whatever you want.